The world held its breath. Birds ceased their songs. The usual chatter of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of animals, all fell silent. It was as if nature itself had paused, waiting, anticipating. Wind no longer rustled leaves. The air was still, unnaturally so, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. The trees stood motionless, their branches frozen in place, creating an eerie stillness that was almost palpable. An unnatural hush fell, thick and heavy, suffocating. It was a silence that seemed to seep into the very ground, into the roots of the trees and into the hearts of every creature that dwelled there. It was a silence that carried weight, a silence that spoke volumes. It pressed down, a weight on the chest of every living thing. The pressure was almost physical, a tangible force that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. It was as if the world was being smothered by an invisible hand. This was not the peace of slumber, but the terrifying anticipation of a predator. It was the kind of silence that comes before a great upheaval, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, that makes your heart race with a primal fear. For the first time in millennia, the earth itself felt fear. The ground seemed to tremble ever so slightly, as if it too was aware of the impending doom. The very essence of the land seemed to shiver, resonating with an ancient dread. The silence stretched, thin and taut, ready to snap. It was a silence that felt like it could break at any moment, unleashing something terrible and unstoppable. It was a silence that held within it the promise of chaos and destruction. It was the calm before a storm, the quiet whisper before a scream. The kind of calm that is more unsettling than any noise, because it is the calm that comes before the storm, the calm that signals the arrival of something catastrophic. And in that silence, something stirred, something ancient, something hungry, something evil. It was a presence that had been dormant for eons, now awakening with a malevolent intent. The air grew colder and the darkness seemed to deepen, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart by this awakening force. From the darkest corners of the internet, from the depths of forgotten forums and buried threads, they crawled. Whispers, at first barely audible, names spoken with reverence and dread. Slender Man, Jeff the Killer, Eyeless Jack, each name a shard of ice in the veins, a promise of unimaginable horror. They echoed in the silence, carried on the backs of static and broken code. These were not stories to be told around campfires, but nightmares whispered in the dead of night. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, a chorus of shadows rising. The darkness deepened, shadows stretched and twisted, taking on monstrous shapes. The air grew colder, and an unsettling silence enveloped the surroundings. It felt as if the very essence of fear was seeping into the atmosphere, making every breath heavier, every heartbeat louder. And then the eyes began to appear, pinpricks of malevolent light burning in the darkness. They flickered like distant stars, yet their presence was anything but comforting. Each pair of eyes seemed to pierce through the soul, revealing hidden fears and unspoken secrets. They watched from the woods, from the reflection in the mirror, from the static on the television screen. No matter where you turned, those eyes were there, unblinking and relentless. It was as if they were a part of the darkness itself, an inescapable presence that haunted every corner. Each pair of eyes held a different kind of madness, a different flavor of terror. Some were filled with a cold, calculating malice, while others burned with a wild, untamed fury. The variety of horrors they promised was endless, each more terrifying than the last. The eyes of Slender Man, cold and ancient, promising oblivion. They were like windows to an unfathomable void, a place where time and space ceased to exist. The mere sight of them could freeze the blood in your veins, leaving you paralyzed with dread. The wide, bloodshot stare of Jeff the Killer filled with a gleeful insanity. His eyes were a chaotic swirl of madness, a reflection of a mind that had long since abandoned any semblance of sanity. They were eyes that promised pain and suffering, a glimpse into a world of unending torment, the empty sockets of eyeless Jack, leaking a viscous black ooze. It was as if the darkness itself was bleeding from his eyes, a tangible manifestation of his malevolence. The sight was both horrifying and mesmerizing, a grotesque reminder of the horrors that lurk in the shadows. They were everywhere, watching, waiting. No matter how fast you ran or how well you hid, those eyes would always find you. They were the silent observers of your deepest fears, the relentless pursuers of your darkest nightmares. In the end, there was no escape from the eyes in the static. The silence shattered. The whispers became screams. It was as if the very air had been torn apart by the sheer force of terror. The once quiet night was now filled with a cacophony of fear, a symphony of terror that seemed to have no end. The creatures of Creepypasta, no longer content to lurk in the shadows, unleashed their terror upon the world. These beings, born from the darkest corners of the internet, had crossed over into reality. Their presence was a nightmare come to life, a horrifying blend of fiction and reality that no one could escape. Slender Man stalked through the night, his long limbs stretching impossibly, his very presence driving men mad. He moved with an eerie grace, a silent predator in the darkness. His faceless visage was a void, a black hole that seemed to suck the sanity out of anyone who gazed upon it. The streets were his hunting ground, and no one was safe from his relentless pursuit. Jeff the Killer left a trail of blood and madness in his wake, his twisted grin a horrifying mockery of joy. His eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to pierce through the soul of his victims. He moved with a terrifying speed, a blur of white skin and dark hair, leaving behind only screams and blood. His laughter, a chilling sound, echoed through the night, a constant reminder of the horror he brought. Eyeless Jack stalked the streets, his claws dripping with a hunger that could never be satiated. His eyeless sockets were a void, a terrifying abyss that seemed to consume all light. He moved with a predatory stealth, a shadow among shadows, always hunting, always hungry. The fear he inspired was palpable, a cold dread that seeped into the bones of anyone who crossed his path. The world descended into chaos. Screams echoed through the night. The once peaceful streets were now a battleground, a place where nightmares roamed free. The air was thick with fear, a suffocating presence that seemed to choke the life out of the city. Every corner, every alley was a potential death trap, a place where terror could strike at any moment. Blood stained the streets. Nowhere was safe. The city had become a living nightmare, a place where the line between reality and horror had blurred beyond recognition. The once familiar streets were now unrecognizable, transformed into a landscape of fear and death. The Symphony of Terror played on, a never-ending crescendo of screams and horror that seemed to have no end in sight. From the collective darkness, from the shared terror of millions, something new began to take shape. A monstrous entity, born of fear itself. It was a swirling vortex of shadows and screams, its form constantly shifting, defying description. This was the Creepypasta incarnate, the embodiment of every nightmare, every whispered horror story. It was the culmination of their power, their essence distilled into a single, terrifying entity, and it was hungry. The entity, fueled by fear and despair, rampaged across the globe. Cities crumbled, forests burned. The very fabric of reality seemed to unravel in its wake. It was a force of pure annihilation, driven by an insatiable hunger for suffering. Those who survived the initial onslaught were driven mad by the sight of it, their minds unable to comprehend the sheer horror of its existence. They were left as gibbering wrecks, haunted by images they could never unsee. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The entity's power was absolute, its reach limitless. It haunted the dreams of the living, turning their sleep into a waking nightmare. It whispered to them in the darkness, promising them a fate worse than death. Hope, it seemed, had died. The world had become a labyrinth of fear, each corner holding a new terror. The lines between reality and nightmare blurred. The creatures of Creepypasta roamed freely, their power amplified by the entity's presence. Humanity had become prey in its own world, hunted by the very stories it had created. The entity's gaze swept across the ravaged world, its hunger still unsated. It had consumed their fear, their despair. Now it craved something more. It craved their very essence, their souls, and it would not rest until it had devoured them all. So beware the stories you whisper in the dark. Beware the creatures that lurk in the shadows of your mind, for they are listening and they are waiting. The creepypasta is real, and it is coming for you next.